Greetings, gamers. Tim here again. And this will probably be a relatively short video game. Video. Yeah, video game. You can control the Tim as he goes through his ultimately boring life. I wanted to come here today and talk about old school rules or OSR movement. And some of the odd things I find in it, like the excisement of clerics, is a pretty common occurrence. And to me, that feels like you're missing some of the old school rule things that I enjoyed. Now, I admit we did not necessarily play hardcore by the rulebook of the particular rulebooks I used at the time, but we made it work and we made it fun, and that was the important part. Now, that being said, there are some incredible games out there that have been produced that are technically OSR. Mazes and Minotaurs, Scene or Sign Nominees, various iterations of games are just fantastic. I have a new favorite at the moment, that's Barbarians of the Ruined Earth, which strikes a decent balance between kind of OSR mechanics and Thunder the Barbarian's feel. Not perfect, because, getting a cartoon's feel in a game takes building a game around a cartoon themes, which is not the easiest, but it does a really good job. And I'm definitely impressed by the work that went into this. So when I say that, I'm saying that I haven't seen one so far that blows me out of the water so much that I'm like, yeah, I'm going to convert all my games to that. It's not going to happen anyway, but the whole point is there are some fantastic games there. And I miss some of the old school games I played, but most of those were not based on Dungeons and Dragons. And most of what most people's old school games are based on Dungeons and Dragons. That doesn't mean all of them are, but that tends to be the OSR grouping. They just tend to be this thing. And I exist a little bit outside that thing, and that's okay. Now, when I say this, I say it with love, and I say it with a lot of appreciation for the hard work people have done. But nobody has yet written a game that is based on some form of old school rules that work the way we actually played. A lot of them, for example, rip out the cleric as a class. And that to me is a pretty core thing for me, because while I'm not talking about OD&D, I'm talking about basic D&D is what I began with, sort of. I started a little bit before that, and it's complicated. But basic D&D was what I mostly played until I was introduced to AD&D in junior high. And then later second edition, and so on and so forth. By the end of second edition, right before third edition, I was burned completely out of D&D and D&D-like mechanics. And then third edition came along. I did some fantastic things, but it also did a lot of things I didn't like. Now, that isn't to say it didn't have good ideas. It just did some things I didn't like. And then 4E completely reversed me entirely in going, I tried it. I did try third edition. I played it for about 6 months. I ran it for about 6 months. And that year worth of gaming was enough to just make me say, no, this isn't for me. It's not what I want. 4E wasn't what I wanted at all. After trying to play, it sounded neat. It was a good idea. And the sad thing is that the Gamma World iterations of the rules, if they ditched the cards, would have made a really fantastic game. If they just ditched the cards and instead said, here's your 4 or 5 powers, and you can use this one, or this one, or this one, or this one, or this one. And once you've used it, you can't use it again. You have to use one or the other. And that would have been fine because it would have kept the randomness a little lower and still worked with their themes, but it explained the rules so much better than the original 4th edition handbook. So I've looked at several things. I've looked at the white hat, the black hat, black hack. I've looked at derivatives like white star. I've looked at, of course, C-nominee various games, which I really find appreciative of because they did something I could not do quite well. But I've been thinking on this. I want to take the ideas of the way we played old school games and implement them into a new game. That doesn't mean they'll fit into the OSR label. In fact, they probably won't because they will be quite a bit alien to people who are stuck on that framework. But it will be closer to how we played it than how the rules are written. And that means that there will be a lot of similar elements, like, you'll still have classes and you'll still have levels and you'll still have attributes, but they won't look a lot like traditional old school games. And that's the point. It's not about fitting in with something else. It's about recalling what I loved about playing games with a GM or with me as a GM and the flexibility of our ability to rule on a situation and make something fun happen. So I'm going to build the rules to allow people permission, that is, explicit permission. Here are the rules. The first one is your job is to make this fun. If a rule gets in the way of making it fun, ignore the rule. Because there are a lot of things we didn't worry about. We didn't worry about you having to basically stand still, be completely immobile except for moving your hands and feet, and speak to cast the spell. So we didn't worry about that. We didn't have components in the old school games for the most part that we played that were D&D-like. That came along a little bit later, except in certain spells. We liked a lot of different things about it. We often used attribute checks. If there was no otherwise defined ability to do something, we just made an attribute check. And if it worked, it worked. If it didn't, it didn't, and we moved on. And so that's basically what I'm interested in doing, is writing down how we played and turning it into a game. It is probably more neo old school, sort of like re-envisioning what old school was, down to the point that our little groups that we played with, and I played with maybe 4 or 5, maybe more groups, and some played harder to the rules and some did not, and I usually lasted longer in the groups that played not as close to the rules, but made ruling. And while I know that that's true of a lot of old school game systems that are out there, I'm not into playing, this is fantasy Vietnam. I'm not going to use the curse word that people often apply to that. But that's not what I want. I want a game where people make a character, they enjoy playing that character for a while, and it is entertaining. It is fun. It is exciting. There are challenges to overcome. But the challenge isn't always going to be, and suddenly you die because you took too much damage. Suddenly you faced an enemy that nobody could hurt because the GM forgot that there's no magic weapons in the party. So it's going to be something that I'm going to work on over time and see how it falls out. I've got some ideas. And they begin with looking at the D&D Cyclopedia and some recent material by the wonderful author Bruce Hurd, who created Kaladar as a setting for old school games. And that setting just looks amazing. I've got to buy everything for it because it's kind of fantasy and space opera-y, but starts out, a little less space opera and moves to space fantasy opera. And it just looks interesting. And I want to try it out, see what it looks like. I tend to write my own settings anyway, but I know I'm going to be writing my own rule system to give us the feel of how D&D for us back at that time played. Not necessarily looking at the rules and going, well, we want to keep this rule, we want to change this rule. We're going, okay, how did it feel? Can we put that down on paper and explain that to people? And I believe, yes, I can put it down on paper and explain it to people. Now, I've got so much other work to do in the meantime. Mostly it's just throwing ideas at the wall and seeing if they stick. I know that right now, the core game will be, of course, what fantasy elements I want to keep. And that will be fighter, mage, thief, cleric, although I may switch it to rogue because I like the idea of rogues being more than just thieves. So you've got the holy person, the fighter person, the skill monkey, and the magic user. And then you have the races who have their own foci, which means, you've got an elf who's basically a fighter magic user. But it's not going to be quite as clear cut as that, because I'm thinking of adding some additional elements to every single class. Humans get a choice of 4 classes, and each one of those will probably have 3 splits they can take. Very similar to 5th edition in some ways. But so will elves. Elves will have a 3 split. They won't get access to the 4, but they have their own 3 split. Dwarves will have their own 3 split. Halflings will have their own 3 split. Whether I put gnomes in the game or not depends on what I'm doing with the setting. I may include orcs as a player character race, and I'm definitely including a feline race inspired by, very loosely, by some of the later basic D&D material, if you're familiar with it. If you're not familiar with it, you won't even know what I'm talking about. But the core book will be mostly like the encyclopedia. It will present the rules, it will present the races, human, elf, dwarf, halfling. They will be my own takes on those things. So, and please excuse the brownouts. I live in Texas, and after the snow, we didn't get a blackout here. My friends were without power for 90 hours. But I haven't had a blackout, we've just had brownouts. So the fact that I'm still recording this is an amazing thing. But the lights are possessed in the meantime by electrical gremlins. But there are things I want to examine that the encyclopedia didn't examine very well, like gem dragons. Where did they come from? Why are they there? How do they differ from the other, chromatic and metallic dragons? What were their origins? And so, I've got to play around and see what comes up. And I want to make each race a truly unique thing. Humans, of course, will still maintain their versatility, and their ability to, take very significant different directions than the default. But are they an upstart race? Are they an older race? I'm not quite sure yet. I'm still, as I said, throwing ideas at the wall and seeing what fits. I'm actually of the opinion I think I should be the ancient race. It was the first race, and they screwed up, and everything that went wrong for a long, long time was their fault. And then the other races appeared later on because of humans doing bad things and good things and making mistakes and manipulating things. But that's one idea. Only one idea. I have dozens of ideas for where I'm going to take it and what I want to do. Now, that doesn't mean I'm ever going to get this actually written, because I've got to get Hearts and Souls out. I've got to get my Wushu Space Opera, or Wushu Space Opera / Bang Bang Sheng, if I get that pronunciation right, game, because it's going to have a little bit more magic and a little bit, less true Wushu type stuff. And I want to get out my Neo Cyberpunk game. It's near the end of what would be considered the cyberpunk age. But before the shift from cyberpunk to transhumanism, it would be in those closing years, that gap right before we swap over to a new age, to a more advanced stage, or fall backwards. In the meantime, I've got things to run, things to do, things to play. And I'm fighting, illnesses. I had COVID last year, late November, early December. I had a virus a few weeks ago that was neither flu nor COVID. Got my COVID vaccine and I'm waiting on the second dose, which should come in about a little less than a week. But it's just been a crazy year and some for me. I mean, I've had an ingrown toenail for over a year. And I went back to the doctor and she went and pulled out more toenail. I'm like, it had just grown back. But she dug in and pulled out this dagger-like little tiny fang, like a snake had bit me and left a tooth behind. Poisonous snake, because it hurt. And it just, lots of craziness. That's what's going on in my life. And I'm not saying don't go enjoy the OSR, but be careful with what you choose. I mean, there are lots of creators out there who are farming people for money, basically, producing a product, not producing support. And believe it or not, I believe in support, even if I haven't put a lot into High Valor or Hearts and Souls. A lot of that has just been life getting in the way. Married, divorced, etc., etc., etc. But I do intend to make more products and more supporting stuff. Hearts and Souls will probably be open to license, which I'm not sure about that. I've got to figure out how much I can do open license and how much needs to retain proprietary content, Creative Commons stuff. But we'll see. I don't want to do the traditional OGL. I want to do Creative Commons. And that's where I'm going at this point. So this is just a short video. I'm working on a lot of crazy ideas, and I keep thinking I have played 5th edition quite a bit. And I'm like, about half the time I'm bored. Although the last time I played, I laughed so hard over what both my character, and my friend, his character, were doing to these poor priests who are trying to destroy these liches phylacteries, because there's not just one, but 4 or 5 liches phylacteries. And that we found in a box that people were hunting, and we took it to the one person we knew who might know something about this, and she got very mad and called in a bunch of priests and wizards, because none of us are that high level. And they were trying to explain. They were like, why haven't you done it yet? Why did you have to wait for us to show up to do this? And it was hilarious, just the arguments and the amusement. And I said, I think they've been, basically whipping themselves. And that fascinated the other character, who's a swashbuckling rogue tiefling, who's like, you self-flagellate? Can I watch? Just, I broke down over that. And it was fun. So, that's it for today. So peace and good gaming. Make sure there's laughter in your games. Sometimes